Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diversability Amplified, the podcast where we elevate disabled pride by sharing disabled stories and community. I am so excited. This is our back to school episode. Everyone's kind of getting in that back to school mindset. I'm super excited to have a couple of guests here to talk to you about that. I am Catherine Lewis, the content manager for Diversability, and I want to welcome Jade Colbo and Haley Moss. I am a Caucasian woman with long dark hair with a black shirt on. I am sitting in my home office in my comfy chair, and behind me you can see my bookshelf with all of my music teaching gadgets that I use as a music teacher when I'm not doing Diversability work. So before we get started with the interview, can both of you please introduce yourselves to us? Jade, can you go first? This is Catherine and I'm done speaking.
Yeah, definitely. This is Jade. Hi, everybody. So I am a 28-year-old Caucasian female with long red hair, and I am sitting in front of, well, I guess I have a green chair behind me with a green wall, and I have a blue shirt on. And that's pretty much it.
This is Catherine. Jade, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your background is in the education?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I can go farther. I just put your description. Yeah, so I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in 2014, like the tail end, December 31st. And I was a senior in college at that time. So I had to deal a lot with kind of navigating my last year of college with a newfound disability. And then right after, I kind of started my master's, and I was in the hospital in and out a lot for that. And now I'm actually a professor. So I actually kind of advocate for my students to share their disabilities as much as possible so that I can give them the adequate care that they need.
This is Catherine. That's amazing, Jade. Can you, Haley, can you introduce yourselves to us before we jump into the interview?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Haley. I am a 27-year-old Caucasian female. I also have red hair, but not as red as Jade's. Mine's more of an auburn red. Sorry, Jade, you just have very awesome red hair, and I had to point that out. I have bangs, so it's down, but my hair is about past my shoulders or so. I have pink lipstick on, and I'm also wearing a shirt that has, it's like this pinkish color, but it has a couple blue butterflies on it. And I'm sitting at my kitchen table, and behind me, you can see a painting of mine that has 3 kids under a rainbow. And there is a portrait of Audrey Hepburn in black and white and some fake plants up on a shelf to give it some color and life in here. So a little bit about my background. I am autistic. I am an attorney, but most of what I actually do for work now that I'm no longer in private practice representing hospital systems is I get to do neurodiversity education and outreach, and I get to mostly work with big companies and making sure that the workplace is accessible and inclusive for all sorts of people who are neurodivergent. And also, I just feel like I have a lot of fun. And like Jade, I also get to teach at the college level. So I adjunct at a college in Indiana. I'm from Florida, but I get to teach over Zoom for the psych department for students who are going to eventually be entering service professions, helping students and young people and clients on the autism spectrum. And I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. That's awesome. Thank you guys so much for your introductions. I'm super excited to have you guys here, given your background in education and the experiences that you guys have had, both as students and as educators. My first question to you is, what has your personal experience been as someone living with disabilities within the education system, whether as a student or as an educator? What has that experience been like for you guys? This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
I think we're both being very nice. This is Jade speaking. We're both like, who's going to go first? I guess I'll just really quickly take away with that, if that's all right. And well, like I said, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease in my senior year of college. So I did a lot of my years as pretty much like a quote unquote, what would you say, normal person, the people would say an abled person. Although I certainly had like OCD and some other things, I really wasn't physically having any problems until then. So I was actually on a half course load just by chance. I had purposely made sure that I took as many credits as I could throughout all the other semesters in my college undergraduate classes, so that by the time I reached my last semester, I could coast through. Ended up being a really, really good thing since I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So I was only like on half credit, so I was technically a part-time student. So, instead of having to deal with a lot of the problems that like I had to deal with in my master's, which I'll get to, I really didn't have to deal with a lot of like the accessibility issues, et cetera, just because I only had like one or two professors and they were all pretty much the same by that point because it was all for the same department. And I just talked to them personally and was like, hey, I have this going on. Just so you know, like, can you help me out? Like if I have to leave or if I can't be here. And they were just like, oh yeah, sure. So that was really, really nice of them. But as we know, it's not always that easy. Totally a lot harder once I got into the master's program. I was kind of okay for like half a year master's program, but then I got some really bad complications with my disease. I got a blood clot, I got PEs, I was in the hospital. I did classes from hospital bed. I actually had to take a semester off. So I really learned that, as a student, you have to advocate for yourself because your teachers don't necessarily know what's going on. And you have to tell them what's going on because otherwise they don't know how to help you. Also, your accessibility department is pretty much one of the biggest things you can do as well. With my master's, I didn't really have to worry about it because it was one class at a time, my specific program. But if I had had a bunch of professors and a bunch of classes, that's definitely something I would have done. And yeah, that's just pretty much how it went for me. And I'm done speaking. Jade's done speaking.
This is Catherine. Haley, can you tell us a little bit about your experience and the different roles that you've had and what it was like in the education system living with disabilities and neurodiversity? This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
Sure, this is Haley speaking. I think for me, I actually started with receiving special education services when I was 3 years old. So that's always kind of a fight. I know for neurodivergent students, especially in public schools, you have to sometimes get early intervention services or have access to getting an IEP created for you. And what was happening because I was diagnosed in the late 90s is our public school system wasn't adequately accommodating me and not really meeting the support that I needed socially, but I didn't need the support academically. So my parents made the decision to pull me out of special education classes. They actually moved. So I enrolled me in private school where I did pretty well. Actually, I did very well academically. And what we would do every year is we'd meet with the teachers before the academic year started. So I would know them, they would know about me. And when I was old enough to understand my own autism, so about the fourth grade or so, I started getting to go to these meetings. So they're more in line with the 504 plans that happen in private schools because private schools don't have to follow the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act because they aren't basically entitled to give you a free and appropriate public education. So at these meetings, I would get to advocate for what my goals were and what I wanted to accomplish throughout the school year to make it more accessible and successful for me. A lot of the time that just meant that I wanted to be friends with other girls on the playground or have assistance in making friends because I always struggled socially. But as I got older, I feel like I got less and less support because it was seen that because I did well academically, I didn't need support. And especially once you get to high school and things like that, social support really isn't on the table. And I think academically and in high school where support really fell apart was in the college admissions and college counseling process because my high school was very much a place that had a lot of pressure for students to go to these very elite high-end brand name schools. And I knew that wasn't something that I wanted. It wasn't something that I knew I'd be able to handle with my disability. I wasn't ready to live away from home. I struggled enough with driving on my own. I just had a lot of other limitations. So when I said I wanted to go to school somewhere that I reasonably won't have to fly home, that kind of made my school disappointed in me. And I ended up going to a Florida school knowing that that's what I can handle, that I can handle being on my own, but not too far away, or able to come home whenever I needed to or if I wanted to. And I did come home a lot in college. I went to University of Florida in Gainesville, which is about 4 hours away from where my parents live. So that was the right amount of distance then that I was able to come home every couple weekends if I wanted to. And I really didn't struggle academically with school, but I did get accommodations from housing because I wanted to live with somebody that who was maybe more experienced socially or had more of a feel of a campus. So I actually got to room as a sophomore. And that was something that was supposed to be helpful. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out. And housing eventually helped me live in a single room on campus, which was wonderful as an accommodation, but that's all they gave me. And I think once I got to graduate school, law school, so to speak, is that's where things kind of fell apart with accommodations, because they didn't want to grant me anything because their accessibility services were really difficult to navigate. They wanted additional documentation, psychoeducation evaluations. And for anyone who's ever had any experience with those formal diagnostic processes for neurodivergent students, they're very expensive. It's not fair. And I decided not to go through with that process. So I was self-accommodating my way through a more challenging workload and curriculum that definitely isn't designed with neurodiversity in mind. And as someone who was newly 21, I didn't really know how to navigate asking for accommodations that weren't extra time, because extra time was what kind of that standard was. And now that I feel like I'm on the other side, like Jadis, as an educator, the way that I see it when I work with students is I don't ask for documentation. I believe you at face value. And I think, what can I do to make my class as accessible to everyone as possible? And after my first time teaching, I realized I need to incorporate an option for a break halfway through class, because class is 90 minutes. I'm like, maybe if we have this little break for 5 to 10, that's enough time that everyone can regroup. You can refocus your attention span, do whatever you have to do, and you're not going to miss anything. So I keep thinking of how can I make my class more inclusive for adult learners and college students, because they have different needs than younger learners as well. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm sure there's probably something in this conversation that we're going to think of as we keep going, but that's all I have for now. And I'm done speaking. This was Haley.
This is Catherine. I love what you were talking about, of that, like that trajectory of like young learners to like, you know, middle-aged teenage learners, that kind of middle of the road part of the education journey. And then once we get to adult learning institutions, how drastically the accommodation and accessibility scene looks like for different learners in different stages. And I'm curious, Jade, I would love to hear from you on this, because Haley did such a good job speaking to her own experience on this. What, in your opinion, this is going to be a really odd question. What, in your opinion, makes each one of these stages so uniquely and different, and why, if there is an answer to the why question, why do you think it looks so different for learners in different stages, although the disability hasn't necessarily changed, the learner has not necessarily changed, they're just older? Why do the accessibility services for learners at different stages look so different, and how can students and parents prepare for how that's going to look differently throughout their learners' stages?
All right, so this is Jade, and I am going to speak. So yeah, you're totally right. I think the reason why we see that difference, and just like growing up and needing that assistance every so often for other things, like, you know, like I mentioned, I think I had OCD when I was younger, anxiety, stuff like that. So I have some experience with like the whole, you know, talking with faculty to kind of get like a Final Four, stuff like that. But yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with like the social needs, for one thing, because obviously like when we're kids, we have different social needs than when we're teenagers, and we have social needs than when we're adults in college. Also different with independence. Independence is a big thing. So like kids can't do certain things. They will need a lot more help in some areas. that, you know, my college students, my students, for example, they won't need, or they, at least they shouldn't, for a lot of them, shouldn't need so much help for stuff like let's just say, for example, getting to their classes. They should be able to do that by themselves. If they can't, they should know how to have an accommodation to help them reach those classes. Kids completely, you know, they have to be managed in that way because they might not know, like it's just managing yourself. I guess executive function really is a big part of it. As you get older, you have more executive function. I guess that's what I would really say. Even if it might not be like the best, like sometimes I don't have the best executive function, for example. I'm not always great at planning things. That's just my personality. But that's definitely what I would think would be the most major part. What students and parents can do about it for different levels is to definitely keep in touch with like their, whether it's your school counselor or whoever runs those different, your disabilities office, your school counselor, whoever runs those different offices or plans and stuff with you, to definitely like, you know, tailor it year to year, because, you know, you can grow and need different things from year to year just because, you know, you might think, oh, well, a kid's not that different from age 12 to 14, but there could be a lot of social differences that are very, very major. And so they need a lot of different things in those plans. And this is Jade, and I am done talking.
Thank you for that really insightful answer, Jade. I think it's really telling that we have this societal assumption that as students and people go through different stages in life, as we get older, we're automatically going to have certain quote unquote abilities. You know, you talk about that executive function. It's an assumption in our society that people are automatically, when they get a certain age, are going to have these certain, you know, innate functions inherent to them as a human being. And we know in the disability community that it doesn't always work that way. And I think that's part of the conversation that is so important to ensuring that students at all levels get the things that they need. My next question is for Haley. Sorry. Haley, I'm really curious. We've kind of touched on it a little bit in our conversation, but we haven't exactly named it. In the education space, we talk a lot about like universal design of learning and universal instruction design and accessible learning. And I would really like to hear from you what exactly accessible learning is for those that may have heard those terms, but aren't exactly sure what it means. What are your thoughts on that, Haley? This is Catherine, and I'm dead speaking.
This is Haley. I think that for me, accessible learning means different things depending on who we're talking about too. So I look at accessible learning as how can we make sure all sorts of diverse learners are able to engage with what we're teaching, and how that they're able to absorb that information, maybe learn from it. So in my last class, I didn't give any exams. I didn't give any quizzes. I just made my students write reflections on the material. And I thought that was a better way for them to engage with it. And what we did as a final project is I gave them some ideas of how to explore something we learned in class and to interpret it in a way that they felt comfortable with. So I had students who were taking this psychology class who are art majors. And I thought if I give them a five-page essay, they might not be as well written, for instance, as someone who's an English major taking this class, or someone who's been taking psych classes and is really great with APA format. It's not fair that they might not do as well on this because they aren't taking advanced level writing classes. So I did this more open to interpretation. And of course, the student in my class who was an art major did this really interesting linoleum block print, basically exploring the themes we did in class. And she made all these different prints in different colors to explore like this idea, this spectrum of like neurodiversity. And she was really explaining why she did what she did. And I really enjoyed that because it showed that she was engaging with what we learned all term on her terms. And it didn't mean that she didn't understand things. It meant that that would have done better for her than writing a 5-page essay. While of course, some of the English majors wanted to write a 5-paragraph or 5-page essay, and that's how they showed what they learned. And Others wanted to just interview somebody in the community to learn more about what autistic people experience. And I thought that was a really powerful way to make class accessible. And honestly, I looked at it, and what I also did with deadlines, I'm like, this is what, please have this in before class. But I also, if you have a reason that you couldn't, I understand, just please be fair with me, level with me to make my life easier too. Because I totally understand if your executive functioning just went kaput. It happens to me a lot. I know that it's really hard to keep up with things, especially when we meet often. So I always tried to make sure when we do accessible learning that students should feel like they're empowered and able to articulate in some form what they learned or what they feel that the big takeaway from a lesson was. I don't think, it's not that I don't believe in assessments or anything, it's just that I don't think it was appropriate in this case, especially with college students that I trusted. They're adults and they're here because they want to be, and they showed up every single class. They were pretty good about things. So at least for me, accessible is how can we make sure that students understand things? And I think when we talk about that with younger learners, it's really interesting because I know everyone has very different access needs, and sometimes access needs conflict with each other. So at least when I was assigning work to my college students too, is I tried to assign things in different formats. So sometimes I would assign them to have a podcast like this, but if you couldn't listen, you had the transcript to follow along with. Or I would give them an article from a reputable journalist source or a newspaper, and sometimes there was a video that would correspond with it, so they can watch that too. So I always tried to figure out how to give different modalities for similar or the same information, so that way if you didn't understand one article but the next week there's a video, you're not going to be completely lost. So I always tried to make sure that we had things as to cater to as many types of learners as possible, because most people I think are very curious and they want to learn. It's just how do we bring learning to them, especially on topics that they're passionate about. And I hope I did okay answering that. I'm done speaking.
No, this is Catherine. You did a great job. And that brings up another question that I have, and I would really like to hear from Jade, and of course, Haley, if you have some input too. I hear from fellow teachers a lot, and even sometimes parents, but educators specifically, that are like, I really want to make learning accessible to all of my students, but there are so many different kinds of accessibility needs. I don't even know where to start. And there are so many different things to do. Like, how am I going to have enough time to actually make all of those accommodations possible? And they spiral and they get so overwhelmed thinking about what it means to create accessible learning. They're just like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to, like, for every lesson, I'm going to have 5 different ways to teach that lesson. And oh my goodness, I'm never going to have enough time to even breathe. How do I do this? Jade, can you tell us a little bit about how teachers can ease that overwhelm in a way that they ease that overwhelm and address accessibility needs in a way that doesn't take up all of their energy and resources and time and end up burning them out, as I hear so many teachers say they're afraid of? This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
All right. Well, this is Jade, and I am going to speak. So as I said, I hope I said I'm an adjunct professor. So basically, and I'm sure Haley knows some of this, what that means is that there's like a structure to the course that I have to follow. And so at least in my university, if you're an adjunct, like, they give you a syllabus, they give you the outline, they give you, like, you have to use these 5 assessments. You cannot change them. You have to use them in the way that they are. Like, so for me, if I teach an English class, I have to give my students 5 papers to do. There are 5 papers for any one of the same class, no matter if you're taking it from me or another adjunct or a professor who is full-time at the university. It's so that everything is consistent. The problem with that, obviously, is when you get to things like questions like this, and you're like, okay, well, what if you have some students who aren't like the best writers? Well, of course, then you have other people in the university going, well, it's a writing class, so of course the point is to learn writing. But as we all know, that's not always so easy with disabilities and stuff like that, to just be like, oh, well, you have to do this. Because, when it's a different way of your actual pattern of thought, or a different actual physical ability in some cases, like attending, maybe for other classes, attending labs or something like that. It's an actual problem. So for me, what I've noticed to do is, even though I have to keep all of those assessments, the same, and I can't change those things, is once in a while I'll kind of either add things, or I might kind of just change the way I grade them, so that I am looking more at, like, for example, if I know a student has a disability and I know they might struggle more with something about maybe voicing their thoughts, like, out on paper. I know some people, even just abled students, that's really hard for some people. Some people, they just can't voice their thoughts on paper. Looking as a whole, like, okay, but like, how hard have they tried? Like, as opposed to looking at everything as how good is it, but actually looking at the work that was put into it, and, the amount of effort, how much the student's showing up, how much the student's trying, how open they're being with you about their struggles. Like, all of those things I definitely use when I'm kind of grading. So for a lot of teachers, I just say that's like the main thing, because if you start to focus on all these little things all the time, like, oh, I need to have transcripts, and I need to have audio, and I need to have, like you said, you can start to spiral. So, certainly if there is a student who has like a specific disability and has reached out to you, or has been obvious about it, like has come with accommodations and has been like, hey, I can't hear well, I need a transcript, is there any way I can get one of those? Like, for sure, like, I'll make sure that's available. And usually, if you Zoom your classes or something, it's kind of just available easily now, a lot of cases, which is great. But, I would say, like, work on making things accessible, but do the parts that you can without like trying to overreach too much and stress yourself out. What are the most common things that you see that are problems? And like, for me, for example, it's like what I was talking about, which is students might not just be able to kind of voice their thoughts correctly onto paper. So you think about, instead of the format of like how things are written out, did they get the point across? How well did they get the point across? Stuff like that, asking kind of big global questions instead of focusing on the little nitpicky stuff like, oh, like how much of it was, is the English spelled wrong, is, kind of the things that, and it's the same with, honestly, students, English second language learners as well. I do the same thing, because, they might not have as clean, quote unquote, of a paper, but did they get their point across? Did they work like super hard? If I know they worked way harder than someone who had like a really clean, good paper, but I know that person kind of halved it, I'll give the person who works harder the higher grade. And some people might, not agree with me on that, but that's just how I do it. And I'm Jade, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Jade, for that perspective on that very real overwhelm for teachers who are trying their hardest, who may not, be as entrenched in universal design for learning, which is like a huge thing. And it can be really overwhelming when you start going down that rabbit hole of universal design. It's super fascinating, but a lot of teachers don't have a lot of experience in it. So that overwhelm is really real. I kind of want to shift gears in my next question. We've talked a lot about the perspective of educators, and I think a really important thing to touch on is the parents or parental figures of like our younger learners, especially, and ways that parental figures and guardians of younger learners can prepare themselves and their students for that accessible learning process. Haley, do you have any thoughts on what parents can do to help prepare themselves, especially in the coming year, for helping advocate for their students who might have unique learning needs. This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
This is Haley. So I think it's really important that parents get as involved as they could. And I think it's a really delicate balance because you don't want to speak over your child's needs, but you also want to be setting a great example as an advocate with them. And I say with your children very intentionally, because eventually, especially as our learners grow older, they don't always get to be the ones, you don't always get to be in the room when they're advocating for their own educational needs. So I know in college, they usually will make a very big stink at orientation about your parents not being the ones who could go talk to your professors. So I think it's really important that there comes a point when parents also know, how do we get our children involved in this advocacy process? And also, how do we know when we think flat out that the school or the district or the other professionals involved in this child's education might not always be on the right track? So I know this is especially true when there's other services that are part of this conversation. So I know sometimes you have special education students who might also be receiving speech therapy or OT or other services while in school or after school. So I think it's important when we have these conversations to realize they are often messy and interdisciplinary at the same time. And sometimes it's up to the parents to really say, hey, this isn't working. And also for educators to treat parents with respect. So something that I saw really circulating around on social media coming from parent educators who are disabled themselves, who have disabled children, is when the team members just call them mom, or like, oh, mom has a problem with this. Is for educators and service providers, please use the parents' names. They're people outside of being so-and-so's parent. I know that my mom is affectionately known still as Haley's mom, but Haley's mom has a name of her own. Her name is Sherry. And when people would say something like, Sherry has concerns about this, I think that also validates the parents. And I think that's important to do too. And I know that in disability advocacy, we always say that it's always about what we want, but when you're young, sometimes a caregiver or a parent is the person who essentially is given the microphone and are the ones who are speaking on your behalf. And you might not always know what you need related to your disability. But I think when it's time for you to come into the picture, the parents have to know when to say when. When do we bring our children into this conversation? And when do we know that we're there to catch them if they don't know how to lead it or advocate for themselves and guide them in that right direction? So I guess that's kind of where I'm thinking is, I think it's very stressful because sometimes you still know your kids better than some of the service providers do, but your kid also knows your kid better than you do. So I think it's really just kind of knowing when to say when on every single aspect. And that's always a little bit of a delicate dance. Full disclosure, I am not a parent. I am not even a parent to a living plant, like we were talking about in visual description. The plants behind me aren't even real. So I am probably not the best person to give parenting advice. Like, I'm very honest about this. I don't have kids. I don't know if I even would like to have kids when I grow up someday. But I think that it's also important to know that kids know more and don't get the credit they deserve oftentimes in their own education. And I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. I am so glad that you touched on that. And I feel like there are so many different roles associated with making sure that our students, whether they are our children or ourselves as either young adult or adult students or educators with disabilities, we have so many different roles associated with it, all these different service providers and the school district and the child and the parents and the caregivers and all of these different roles, and sharing that conversation with all of those people is such an important piece of that puzzle. Making sure that we're communicating and coming from a place of empathy and openness is such a big part of making sure that our students have what they need. I want to touch on something that I know all of us right now are wondering and dealing with, no matter what our role is. The coming school year in the context of COVID school year and all of the things that come with that, and such a different landscape globally than what we expected not that long ago. What unique challenges and also opportunities does this particular school year bring for accessible learning and all of the people in the role trying to make sure that all different kinds of unique learners have accessible learning. Jade, I'd love to hear from you first, but I want to hear from both of you on this one because I think it's something very much on everyone's mind. This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
All right, so this is Jade. I'm speaking. Yeah, so I mean, I didn't really expect that we'd be dealing with this again, I guess. I kind of thought it was over with or done, but it seems like we might have a similar trajectory to last year. So if that is the case, then I think what my university is doing, or at least that I've heard so far, unless something changes, which we all know it could change at any moment, anytime, especially with the Delta variant. But my university was like, well, you can do what you did last year. You can teach one class from home per week. So for me, this semester, I actually only teach 2 days a week and I have long class periods. So I will be utilizing that whole break idea, by the way, Haley. And so, you know, like I will go in, teach on Tuesdays, and then on Thursdays, I'll probably teach from Zoom. For some students, this is an amazing thing because they actually, I think, learn better this way. This way they can go back and look at the material because I do record and I do save and they have the transcripts to look at, stuff like that. So if they miss something, they can just go back and get it. Other students, however, I have realized that they do not thrive in this environment whatsoever. They really need kind of like someone to almost watch them to make sure that they're still paying attention. And this isn't even like necessarily, this is both abled and disabled students. You know, I'm often teaching to just, as you know, on Zoom, just a bunch of silhouettes, black silhouettes. They all turn their cameras off. I can barely hear anything. I feel like I'm talking to a wall. I'm like, is anyone out there? I hope so. And then, you know, I might end up getting a bunch of emails on like the stuff I clearly talked about, but that people didn't listen to. And that's something that I feel like is just really hard with COVID, is it's kind of like when people don't have that accountability of like showing up every day and, you know, having to be present or being there in some way, a lot of students start to lose it. And I can only imagine what that's like if, you know, for more neurodivergent students or students that, you know, have learning disabilities and really struggle with things like as they already are, to try and navigate a different system. At the same time, I did see recently on my local news, for example, that like they were talking about how one of our districts in the area has started to do online learning. And for some students, that has actually been a really beneficial thing because they've actually been able to pay attention more. So some neurodivergent students, like, you know, while they might be distracted in the classroom from people tapping their pens and people, you know, coughing, making noises, if they're at home and they don't have to, you know, listen to these things, then they actually learn better. So it really seems like you have students who go both ways, and you kind of have to try and figure out ways that you can help both types of students with like a hybrid model like this. And I'm Jade and I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. I think you bring up a really important point that, and it's one of the reasons why I asked this question the way that I did, because no matter what role we are in, I've been a student and an educator and an advocate this last year. And so at every turn, there's equal parts challenge and frustration, and also really awesome accessibility opportunities with this hybrid model. Haley, I would really love to hear your thoughts as well on what unique challenges and opportunities this year brings to the accessible learning realm. This is Catherine. I'm done speaking.
This is Haley. I think y'all just hit it on the head pretty well, but I do think there's a lot of challenges, especially coming into the school year. So not even just in the learning environment, but even just going back to school. So I live in Florida, and there's a lot of concern over wearing masks and mask mandates and things like that, that might also be distracting for neurodivergent learners who have sensory issues, for instance. So learning at home might be better, but in some ways it might not be as accessible, and other ways it could. But no matter what, I hope that what we've learned so far is there are ways that we can make learning more accessible, no matter what we do. So I think what Jade was saying about having a hybrid model, I think that's so great. I teach exclusively over Zoom. So for me, my students love it. They love our format. They feel like it's safer for some reason to share things and it's less judgmental. But I also know that for us, we have to have more concerns and we're able to do accessibility better. So even that we're able to have captions and transcripts and record class, that's huge for a lot of my students. And also, I think when we're talking about older learners, like college students that we have, is that sometimes they have other responsibilities while they're students. Is sometimes they're working, sometimes they're taking care of family members. And I think that we have to remember that accessibility isn't just for disabled and neurodivergent students. So I think about the students in my class who are parents themselves. I think about ones who are taking care of aging parents or disabled parents or siblings or other family members. I think about the ones who are working a job or two outside of school, and thinking about how even a recorded class, for instance, for them might be super accessible, that they're able to tend to their other responsibilities. I just think that virtual learning needs to stay, and anyone who is against it doesn't realize that it doesn't just benefit disabled people who might have access to being able to get services that they need at home. So maybe you have more flexibility in going to something like physical therapy if you need it, but also that it benefits people who have different life circumstances, that going to school full time and being on campus full time might be a huge problem. I think that we really have to remember how learning affects everyone and how people do have more than what goes on in school. And this is Haley, and I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. I am so glad that you talked about all of the other possible intersections that affect accessible learning, because, you know, in our community, we talk a lot about what accessible learning is, and there's such a focus on the disabled community, which is amazing because we are heavily impacted by inaccessible learning models. However, so are non-disabled people of varying kind of demographics, you know, and I don't want to speak for other people's intersections. And I was sad that we had a couple of guests that were going to join us today that would have been able to speak on that weren't able to make it. But I'm really glad that you brought that up, because, you know, considering the other lived experiences besides the disability, you know, spectrum, is a really important part of the accessible education, you know, goal, and movement. And I think, you know, we talked about this earlier, that accessible learning is a model that benefits everybody. That's why it's designed the way that it is, so that no matter what your lived experience is and what demographic you're from or what intersections you're a part of, it's going to benefit you regardless. And I think that's the ultimate goal of creating accessible learning styles and models. And I, like you, Haley, hope that it's something that we've learned this year, that accessible learning really is possible, and that these kinds of models, even though they may not be inherently, you know, quote unquote necessary in the emergent sense that they were in the last year and a half, are very much still deeply needed for a growing population of our society. And I hope that it continues as well, because so many of us benefit from it for a variety of reasons, not even related to disability. The last question I have for you both before we wrap up today's awesome conversation on getting back to school is how we as a community, both the disabled community and allies and the general population who may not be identify as either one of those categories, how can we as a community support learners of all ages, whether they're the little guys that I teach or they're the adults that both of you teach, how can we as a community support learners in their journey towards accessible learning? I would love to hear from Jade first. We haven't asked you a direct question in a while. So can both of you kind of speak on that, how the community can support these learners? This is Catherine, I'm done speaking.
Yeah, this is Jade, I'm speaking. I mean, really the best thing I think the community and just everyone can do is to push for education reform and for education to do some more of that, kind of, whether it be hybrid or another model, some sort of like different accessibilities, just because like you said, and like Haley said, everyone, even if they don't have a disability, like everyone has different accessibility needs. For example, like I have a lot of English second language students, and so they benefit greatly from having like a recording and especially a transcript, because they might hear a word and be like, I don't know what that English word is. And then if they see it though, then they'll be like, oh, it's that one. And then they can go look it up, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's really, really helpful for them. So I think that's the best thing that anyone can do just for all learners actually, is to make things, more accessible, to advocate for that in general. Like maybe does that take more funding? Maybe we need to advocate for more funding to education, like if so, because the education system as it stands now, I feel like is still very antiquated. Like it's very still, even though we see computers being used now, we're not utilizing all the things that they give, like transcripts and video and audio and all that sort of thing. So that's like the biggest thing, at least I think. And I'm Jade, and I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. I am very much in agreement that that is a huge step forward in the effort for better accessible education for everyone. Haley, I would really love to hear your thoughts about how we as a community can help support learners of all ages and all kinds. This is Catherine, and I'm done speaking.
This is Haley. So I really want to echo Jade's point about education reform. And I think a lot of that also comes from what goes on at the state level and federal policy level too. So especially for disabled learners, we have a kind of difficult time. So if you know about the history of IDEA, which entitles public school students to a free and appropriate education if they have disabilities, that Congress pledged to fund all of the additional costs, or at least up to 40%, I believe, of the cost of special education, the additional costs, and they barely fund about 15% of that. So there is a huge gap in funding, and state and local education budgets have to kind of fill in the gaps there. And sometimes it's just not possible, especially depending on where your community is, what resources your community has. So there's a huge gap in quality of education depending on where you are located, which is super unfair, to be honest. So I think even just having that kind of reform on the policy end, but I think something that's actionable that you can walk away with if you are a parent, an educator, or a student is having that empathy for what your students may be experiencing or what you're experiencing. So like what we were talking about with accessible education, is it doesn't just benefit disabled learners, it benefits all learners. And I think it's really cool when we were talking about how Jade's class had a lot of English as second language learners or multiple language speakers, and how they are able to benefit from accessibility. I don't have that in my class, or my classes haven't had that yet, but I do have students who have attention deficit and auditory processing issues and differences that really do benefit from those transcripts and those captions. And my biggest regret is we couldn't figure out how to get it to work at the beginning of the semester. So it took a while to get up and running, but I think having accessibility in class is so important. And I wish, looking back, even when I took online classes in college, that was things that happened in my education. I think it would have been better. And I think what happens with a lot of students is accessibility doesn't seem important unless you're either performing poorly academically or you actually advocate for it. So I didn't get kind of classified as someone who would need accessibility because I had good grades. So I think we have to understand that we have to be empathetic in that grades don't tell a whole story. They don't tell you anything about a human being. So that goes into students who I know are working towards getting into college, grad school, or maybe making honor roll, that your grades don't define you and they don't tell you anything about who you are as a human being. So please don't let that define your worth and overly stress out about that. And education should be accessible to whoever wants it and needs it. And that especially goes for adult learners who don't always have to be in a formal education setting to continue their learning. So education comes in many forms. It might even come from you listening to this podcast today. And hopefully, if that's part of it, I hope that this experience was accessible for you. And I think it should be for anybody who wants it. So keep advocating and don't be afraid to be empathetic and vulnerable with others as well. So that's all I have to say. And this is Haley, and I'm done speaking.
This is Catherine. I could not have closed out with better thoughts if I tried. That you said everything that we hoped to convey today, Haley and Jade. Thank you both so much for being here today and talking about what it's going to be like for those in all different kinds of roles to go back to school this year. And we hope here at Diversability that today's podcast has helped you listeners out there, to feel empowered and feel better prepared to advocate for yourselves, your students, and your educators this year to have the most successful and amicable and empowering school year that you could possibly have. Thank you both, Jade, Haley, for being here today. And thank you, listeners, for listening to our second episode of this podcast, Diversability Amplified. And until next time, thank you all, and we will see you next month on our next episode.